So we're in the last third of the book now, and it's the part of the book that Kaufmann seems to have the most criticism for, and perhaps rightly, where Nietzsche really shows his Wagnerian colors here, and he ventures really kind of off the path from the case that he's making philologically about Greek tragedy and talking more about contemporary German culture and its superficiality. I think Kaufmann's correct to criticize this part of the book as the weakest part, but I think what we're going to see, and there's a lot of sections where we're going to be able to gloss over a lot more because we have, in some sense, covered many of the main ideas of the book. But I think where Kaufmann might miss some things in the value of the later third of the work is insofar as Nietzsche's ideas and his focus here and the way that he's thinking. I think, again, we see the development of his later thought. And really, a lot of the end of Birth of Tragedy almost dovetails directly into the Untimely Meditations period, which, unsurprisingly, that's what Nietzsche began writing directly after this. But we see how his assessment of Hellenic culture begins to inform his assessment of contemporary German culture. And it's the basis, sort of his cultural critique. And so, I don't know, with that sort of preamble, we'll go into section 18, where Nietzsche begins, quote, "It is an eternal phenomenon. The insatiable will always finds a way to detain its creatures in life and compel them to live on by means of an illusion to spread over things," end quote. So we can obviously look to Schopenhauer and this description. I mean, when Nietzsche says the insatiable will, he's talking about the ontological character of reality from the Schopenhauerian point of view of the will to live as primary. And this is much of what Schopenhauer says about the will, that it always seduces us to continue to want to go on living, even though the best thing for us, the true freedom from suffering, which would be, happiness in the purest sense to Schopenhauer, because happiness is a negative principle. The absence of pain and suffering would actually be to renounce life and renounce the will, right? But what's interesting here is that Nietzsche, as we'll see throughout the rest of this paragraph, but also, as I've sort of pointed out, throughout this entire discussion, already reveals that he doesn't share in Schopenhauer's assessment of life as something that we should or ought to repudiate. And again, this goes back to the pessimism of strength, but versus pessimism of weakness distinction he makes in the preface, which I think was later Nietzsche being able to, with some distance, interpret more coherently the distinction between himself and Schopenhauer that maybe he didn't even perceive yet at this point in his writing. But I just thought it bears pointing out here that, because Nietzsche seems to draw very heavily on Schopenhauer, but waver at times in how much he's willing to actually transcend Schopenhauer's philosophy, I think here we see a good sort of summation of how Nietzsche capitulates to the Schopenhauerian assessment of life while still seeming to affirm the what does he just say? The means of illusion spread over things by the will in order to seduce us to, to compel us to live on, right? Nietzsche, it's not entirely clear from the sentence, but as we'll see as we go through the rest of this paragraph, Nietzsche affirms this, right? And so, so he says, quote, and he's describing here the different illusions that life can use to detain us in life and compel us to live on. So he says, quote, "One is chained by the Socratic love of knowledge and the delusion of being able thereby to heal the eternal wound of existence." So that's Socratic optimism, right? Quote, "Another is ensnared by art's seductive veil of beauty fluttering before his eyes," end quote. That would seem to be Apollo in some sense, but as we'll later see in the passage, Nietzsche might apply this to the Greeks generally. Quote, "Still another by the metaphysical comfort that beneath the whirl of phenomena, eternal life flows on indestructibly." end quote. And so that we might say is sort of a description of the Dionysian, right? But again, it's such a Dionysian illusion is only possible through Apollo, right? Because otherwise you could have the ecstatic experience of becoming one with the primordial, being and the primordial pain and contradiction, but that won't be brought before your self-reflection in a sort of represented form, right? Because it constitutes a complete loss of the self-identity and the individuality. So there's no way to represent that without the Apollinian, representative faculty, right? And so then Nietzsche says, quote, to say nothing of the more vulgar and almost more powerful illusions which the will always has at hand, end quote. So these might be, things, illusions like that seeking after pleasure could actually provide some sort of fulfillment in the ultimate scheme of things, right? Or something like that. Or that, through reproduction, one could partake of immortality and through, carrying on with children or whatever. These would all be, I'm sort of drawing again on Schopenhauer and what he would have to say about the various sort of illusions that we might say, Nietzsche calls them vulgar illusions, which people commonly have, which sort of keep them from perceiving the horror of existence as total suffering. But these three types of illusion, which he calls in the next sentence, three stages of illusion, which they don't seem to me to really be stages. He says that these, quote, are actually designed only for the more nobly formed natures who actually feel profoundly this weight and burden of existence and must be deluded by exquisite stimulants into forgetfulness of their displeasure, end quote. So in a sense, we might say, the vulgar man doesn't need such complex or more elevated, exquisite illusions because he says more nobly formed, but we might say someone, who hasn't had the ability to self-reflect and bring before their mind all of these existential considerations that Schopenhauer might raise, might not need to have a philosophy of life in order to sort of stave off nihilism, as Nietzsche might say in his later lexicon. But Nietzsche makes a shocking claim where he says, quote, all that we call culture is made up of these stimulants, which it's interesting because it's sort of a provisional definition of culture. And we get one sort of in bits and pieces throughout the Untimely Meditations, but this is really his first offering of defining what a culture is. And so his provisional definition that he's working with in this text is that culture is the series of illusions provided to, more civilized human beings who have sort of been raised up out of the blind willing of the animals, who no longer can just abide with more simple illusions or inducements to life, but need a more complex illusion. And so Nietzsche says, quote, according to the proportion of the ingredients, we have either a dominantly Socratic or artistic or tragic culture. Or, if historical exemplifications are permitted, there is either an Alexandrian or a Hellenic or a Buddhistic culture. Now, Kaufmann, in his footnote, he notes that Nietzsche, in the second version, had changed Buddhistic to Brahmanic, and he says that it would seem that both Buddhistic and Brahmanic depend on some misconception. Neither seems to make much sense. I think Kaufmann, I think it actually makes perfect sense to me, and I'm a little confused as to why Kaufmann didn't see it, and I wonder how familiar he really was with the work of Schopenhauer. Because, the way Nietzsche describes the third type of illusion, which he then associates with the Buddhistic culture, or he decodes that as a tragic culture, he says, it's the metaphysical comfort that beneath the whirl of phenomena, eternal life flows on indestructibly. And that's exactly how Schopenhauer speaks of, his view of what reality really is. That the indestructible nature of life and being flows on, and individual phenomena seem to die and, be born, arise, and pass away, but that's a sort of illusory representational realm. And so if you know that, and then you know that Schopenhauer saw himself as a Buddhaist and believed that this was, not only compatible with the work of Plato and Kant, but also Eastern philosophy and religions such as Buddhism, which is why Nietzsche probably wavered between Brahmanic and Buddhistic, because Schopenhauer draws on both. And, as we've also said, this is also seems to track with the experience that Nietzsche describes as the Dionysian. And so that might be the place where it might be confusing, and maybe that Kaufman got confused, and it certainly confused me, because how could the Dionysian be correlated with Buddhism, this religion of austerity and temperance and sobriety, versus the ecstasis and drunkenness of Dionysian ritual? But remember, Nietzsche he doesn't approve of alcohol consumption recreationally any more than the Buddhists do. He, and this whole discussion is talking about, intoxication in a ritual context. One in which there are clear boundaries, and you're not expected to do this, all the time, or that it's considered moral or proper to, engage in this dissolution of your individual self-conception. And so I would simply point out, for one, meditative absorption, jhana. The Pali Canon is full of the Buddha basically saying, we will teach the monks, the Shravakas, to renounce the fleeting illusory pleasures of the world in exchange for the pleasures of jhana. And it's sort of implied that this meditative absorption is a form of ecstatic rapture. Now, I'm sure some Buddhists might have some problem with that it's not supposed to be like this, sense pleasure experience. The higher jhanas are supposed to be sort of beyond that. But I suppose I'm just pointing out that Buddhism has its rituals of the dissolution of one's self-image or self-conception, as we were just talking about. And so we might say that the aim of the Dionysian ritual and the Buddhist meditative practice is the same. And they both, at least according to Nietzsche, interpreting Buddhism through Schopenhauer, and quite frankly, interpreting Greek culture through Schopenhauer, actually sees the same underlying tendency in the Dionysian as in the Buddhistic culture. And so it's very clear to me that, in some sense, the Buddhistic culture is the one that has the greater proportion of the Dionysian. And this is what he says makes it a tragic culture. Now, this is actually a contradiction, because Nietzsche uses the term tragic culture to describe Hellenic culture, actually later in the same section. So I think where he designates the Hellenic as an artistic culture and the Buddhistic as a tragic culture, that's where things get like a little bit confusing, because he mixes up the terms. But I think it's much clearer once we see that the descriptions he gives of these three types of illusions map very, very closely onto the Socratic and then the Apollinian and the Dionysian. And understanding, of course, that the Apollinian and the Dionysian really sort of need each other to be fully manifest in a given culture, right? Because the Apollinian, in some sense, lacks the spiritual or metaphysical power it needs that comes out of music or comes out of that ecstasis, and isn't really sufficiently powerful to seduce one to life, right? To provide that, what does he say? The seductive veil of beauty. And furthermore, and again, veil, the veil of Maya, the seductive veil of beauty. So, and Apollo is illusion. So very interesting, correlations Nietzsche is drawing between ideas in Eastern and Western traditional religions, by the way. So that's another interesting thing. But again, Apollinian would be, or the Hellenic would be, have a surfeit of the Apollinian more so than the Dionysian, although we can imagine they would have both. Buddhistic culture would have more of the Dionysian impulse. And that's, whether, again, maybe Kaufman is also looking world historically. Does this actually describe any sort of culture that was dominated by Buddhism that actually existed? I don't think Nietzsche's thinking in those terms, actually, because frankly, he doesn't know as much about Eastern, civilizations and religion, at least limited by what the information they had at the time in 19th century Europe. In the Alexandrian, there's absolutely no question what that is. It's the Socratic, which is that the Apollinian or the Dionysian type of, saving illusion? Well, it's neither. It's the Socratic, which, as we pointed out, it's sort of like you could see it as the child of Apollinian individuating impulse, but in some way, the theoretic is this abstracted offspring, which is separate from either the Dionysian or the Apollinian. And so the Alexandrian sort of has a preponderance of the Socratic element. That's what is driving the culture. And it's worth noting that when it comes to maybe another thing that might throw someone off is that the terms Hellenic and Alexandrian actually do map on to historical societies. And here, Kaufman's footnote will be a little bit more, interesting for us. He says, quote, "It's not uncommon to distinguish the Alexandrian period of Greek literature from the immediately preceding Attic period. The great tragic poets, as well as Thucydides, Plato, and Aristotle, are associated with Athens and belong to the immensely creative 5th and 4th centuries." Skipping further down, the glories of Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Hellenic world from about 300 to 230 BC, include no remotely comparable creative achievements, but are its immense library, which far surpassed any previous collection, and its often exceedingly erudite scholars. To be sure, one still wrote poetry and vast amounts of prose, but on the whole, the achievements of the scientists and scholars were more remarkable. Nietzsche is plainly suggesting that 19th century Germany is in important respects strikingly similar to Alexandrian civilization. End quote. And so that sort of explains those two. He's getting Alexandrian and Hellenic from two periods of Greek civilization. Notice the Hellenic transitions to the Alexandrian with the death of tragedy. And the Buddhistic is sort of, in some way, I would say, Nietzsche's just ideal image of what a purely Dionysian culture would be. Not purely, but predominantly Dionysian, and he's getting that idea from Schopenhauer of where you would locate such a society, right, in the East. And so the rest of the section is basically a critique of Alexandrianism, we might say, of a culture based on the Socratic. And this is actually one of the best chapters, I think, in the work. It contains a lot of fascinating ideas. So he says that our whole modern world is entangled in the net of Alexandrian culture. Quote, "It proposes as its ideal the theoretical man equipped with the greatest forces of knowledge and laboring in the service of science, whose archetype and progenitor is Socrates. All our educational methods originally have this ideal in view. Every other form of existence must struggle on laboriously beside it, as something tolerated but not intended. In an almost alarming manner, the cultured man was for a long time found only in the form of the scholar. Even our poetical arts have been forced to evolve from scholarly imitations." Skipping further down, "How unintelligible must Faust, the modern cultured man, who is in himself intelligible, have appeared to a true Greek? Faust, storming unsatisfied through all the faculties, devoted to magic and the devil from a desire for knowledge. Faust, whom we have but to place beside Socrates for the purpose of comparison, in order to see that modern man is beginning to divine the limits of this Socratic love of knowledge and yearns for a coast in the wide waste of the ocean of knowledge. When Goethe on one occasion said to Eckermann with reference to Napoleon, quote, 'Yes, my friend, there is also a productiveness of deeds,' end quote, he reminded us in a charmingly naive manner that the non-theorist is something incredible and astounding to modern man, so that we, again, have need of the wisdom of Goethe to discover that such a surprising form of existence is not only comprehensible, but even pardonable." End quote. And so I've made a great deal of that passage when I forget exactly which episode I talked about it in, actually, but the comparison of Socrates and Faust, I think, is very fascinating because, in a sense, they're both Alexandrian, right? I mean, Socrates is the progenitor and archetype of the Alexandrian. He is the essence. Socratism is the essence of Alexandrian culture. And yet Socrates is the alpha, Faust is the omega. He is the modern culture man who has sort of reached the end of the Alexandrian project, right? And what does that mean? Well, that means reaching the end of what are the end limits of the theoretical? Well, it's finding the end of optimism, hitting the limitations of what knowledge can actually provide. Discovering that some of our utopian ideas were not realizable. Discovering that where we thought we had been completely liberated from, or where we thought we could be completely liberated from petty concerns or from animal unconscious desires, that we were actually mistaken. Or that, many of the things that we thought would provide us something akin to the metaphysical comfort that Nietzsche's been seeking sort of throughout this book ultimately didn't provide that, right? Or that the material was not a substitute for the metaphysical. And so Faust is the perfect example of this because he's studied all of the major faculties of the university. He has attained the zenith of human knowledge, so he believes, and so he then begins searching beyond that and trying to explore what does he say? I want to know what secret force moves the world and directs its course, or something like that, and begins to study magic and sells his soul for this longing that is burning deep within him that has not been satisfied by all of his scholarly attainments. And Goethe's words here, his idea, there is a productiveness of deeds. The context of that line is that, Goethe basically prefaces that by saying, because Goethe is a playwright and a poet, he's one of the most prolific poets in the German language and a great playwright. And he basically says, well, productivity does not merely exist in plays and poems. He's talking to Eckermann and sort of saying that we scholarly types tend to think that way, that the legacy we leave behind is sort of this, what we've produced creatively or intellectually, but that there is also a productivity of deeds. And he refers directly to Napoleon. I believe the paragraph starts with Goethe saying, Napoleon was the man. Which, maybe that had a slightly different connotation, but it sounds like very 90s to me, like, you the man, about Napoleon. But that Napoleon was a non-theoretical man, that he didn't have this productivity he didn't leave behind a scholarly or creative legacy. He left behind a legacy of the deeds that he did, of the way that he reshaped the entire French state and in some sense sort of reshaped the face of Europe. And he did that through action. And sort of the most pure form of action from like a Nietzschean standpoint, right? Which is like war, physical force to reshape the world. And that this is not, on the other hand, Napoleon's not a barbarian, right? It's not like he's Genghis Khan. Although Genghis Khan wasn't really Genghis Khan of the popular imagination, to be fair. He did also sort of like create, he was sort of like a prefiguration of the modern state we see in the Mongol Empire, but I digress. You know what I mean? We're not talking about somebody who was just a completely, unself-disciplined, marauder. This was someone who took maybe the same sort of disciplined, ambitious desire to leave behind a legacy, but directed it towards, where the world was his clay, Europe was his clay, rather than an actual something like that. So that's, again, it's great man worship, but I'm trying to get you into the headspace of what Goethe was talking about and what Nietzsche saw in that, and more importantly, how he's sort of faced Socrates against Faust as the beginning and the end of the theoretical approach to culture, and why Napoleon is sort of like that lightning flash of the non-theoretical man, which he also sees in figures like Caesar, for example, right? Who come from outside of, and predating like Christianity, coming from outside of the theoretical culture of Alexandrian Greece, right? All right, so next paragraph, he says, the what is concealed in the womb of this Socratic culture is optimism, with its delusion of limitless power. And he basically says that if we should expect that this sort of Alexandrian belief will, he says, quote, change into the threatening demand for such an Alexandrian earthly happiness, into the conjuring up of a Euripidean deus ex machina, end quote. So no longer able to take life for what it is, for the tragic and primordially suffering existence that this life is, as the art form of Greek tragedy represented. Nietzsche references sort of the end of Greek tragedy, which he sees with Euripides, where the metaphysical comfort, the magical blessing that endures even after Oedipus dies, in spite of his tragic fate, and in some sense justifies and ennobles his legacy. And so you look honestly at the harsh reality, but it's in some sense blessed or enchanted by this tragic art form in all of its savage honesty. But in the Euripidean drama and in the new Attic comedy, that is replaced with the Deus ex machina, where the gods intervene, or where there is an earthly salvation. We depict in our representation in this art form the actual elimination of the problems of life on this earth. And so this sort of correlates with the view of Alexandrian culture that, again, he said optimism and the delusion of limitless power, that we actually that knowledge could actually bring us the zenith of human happiness as Faust hoped for, right? That's the dream of Alexandrianism, and Faust is sort of in some sense, that is the tragedy of Dr. Faustus. That's why it's tragic, right? Is that it the Alexandrian Socratic impulse or whatever that's embodied in Faust is shown to have failed and hit a sort of dead end. Or, maybe not, depending on how you interpret the ending. But I think this is why Nietzsche enjoyed Faust so much and quotes from it so much in this first book, even if you would later have his criticisms of the play. Now, this next paragraph I think is really important, given the, I think, hypocrisy that still exists to this day, to whatever extent that we are still in Alexandrian culture today. Nietzsche says, quote, "Let us mark this well. The Alexandrian culture, to be able to exist permanently, requires a slave class. But with its optimistic view of life, it denies the necessity of such a class, and consequently, when its beautifully seductive and tranquilizing utterances about the dignity of man and the dignity of labor are no longer effective, it gradually drifts toward a dreadful destruction. There's nothing more terrible than a class of barbaric slaves who have learned to regard their existence as an injustice and are prepared to avenge not only themselves, but all generations. In the face of such threatening storms, who dares to appeal with any confidence to our pale and exhausted religions, the very foundations of which have degenerated into scholarly religions? Myth, the necessary prerequisite of every religion, is already paralyzed everywhere. And even in this domain, the optimistic spirit, which we have just designated as the germ of destruction in our society, has attained the mastery." So myth, as we've discussed in the previous sections, is the living part of religion. It is the still flowing magma. It's the fire. It's the life that's still going in the mythopoeic, world enchanting impulse and function of religion. Without that, religions become pale and exhausted, as he says. They degenerate into scholarly religions. I mean, here we can see the influence of Emerson again, or a intellectual kinship with Emerson again, of how religion weakens when it ceases to be alive and becomes a sort of scholarly dead religion. And that's exactly what Nietzsche is criticizing here. And we can see, again, a foretaste of his criticism of religion in terms of this, its failure to stave off nihilism. It's sort of the later framework that he would use, is what he's talking about here. And that, really he raises the sort of the elitist fear of basically socialist and democratic revolutions, where, when all of those illusions that maintained the class system on which the Alexandrian society was based begin to break down and are not believed in anymore. I mean, Nietzsche's sort of in lockstep with Marx here about the religion being the opiate of the masses in some sense, right? It's a illusion to help you continue to endure life and endure a low-class position in the hierarchy, getting basically exploited for your labor. The reason why I think this is still interesting today is because we still have the sort of capitalist realist types and the enlightened centrist types who think that the status quo in our society is, the best situation for mankind that's ever existed, and we should all be grateful to live here. And they often tout, I'm just using their own moral standards, right? I'm not making a moral critique based on any moral claims I would make. I'm just saying, sort of look at how they morally describe, life in liberal democracy in modern times and why it's good. And they'll tell you, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, you have relatively high standard of living and cheap consumer goods, and think about all the technology and the life-saving, medicines and utilities and things that we have access to that have made your lives so much better. And it's just interesting because they rarely acknowledge how the reason why we have many of those things that have greatly increased our standard of living are provided to us by a global system of trade in which people throughout the global south mostly who don't have a high standard of living are exploited and, basically, work for, pennies, on the dollar compared to what an American worker would work for in order to provide all these like cheap goods. And oftentimes they live in authoritarian systems where they don't enjoy the same freedoms that we do. Now, it's one thing to say maybe we might say like a colonialist from the 18th or 19th century might say, that's all well and good for the betterment of my country. We should be like exploiting, all the countries that we colonize for our own benefit. It's another to just deny that reality and then say that we're living in the best sort of modernity possible because of all of the ways that we have improved our lives. The reason why this is relevant is because I think it's a deeply Alexandrian sentiment. And I think Nietzsche's critique perfectly fits the sort of like enlightened centrist capitalist realist, attitude in the West today, right? They are Alexandrians who will tout basically the standard of living we have, which is on the backs of the third world, but deny, with its optimistic view of life, deny the necessity of such a slave class. Or, well, it's not really slavery. We're lifting them out of poverty and making their lives better. As far as whether that's true, that's a mixed story, right? But in general, I mean, companies don't outsource their labor to, like a factory in Malaysia because they can pay them more money than they would be paying, American workers, right? They're doing it to exploit them, right? So yeah, I think we see the same thought patterns today that Nietzsche's talking about. And so what Nietzsche's worried about is that when this theoretical culture ends, when it can't deliver on the promises of knowledge and scientific progress, that's when you get this social unrest. And the worst possible thing is a bunch of barbaric slaves who have believe they're fighting on the side of injustice. And, from the standpoint of somebody who maybe got guillotined in the French Revolution, maybe he's right? But we're not going to litigate Nietzsche's politics here. We're going to save that for next season. So that's why he says, quote, while the disaster slumbering in the womb of theoretical culture gradually begins to frighten modern man, and he anxiously ransacks the stores of his experience for means to avert the danger, though he has no great faith in these means, while he therefore begins to divine the consequences of his situation, great men, universally gifted, have contrived with an incredible amount of thought to make use of the paraphernalia of science itself, to point out the limits and the relativity of knowledge generally, and thus to deny decisively the claim of science to universal validity and universal aims. What does he say? He says, that new scientists have, for the first time, diagnosed the illusory notion which pretends to be able to fathom the innermost essence of things with the aid of causality. The extraordinary courage and wisdom of Kant and Schopenhauer have succeeded in gaining the most difficult victory, the victory over the optimism concealed in the essence of logic, an optimism that is the basis of our culture. A little further down in the paragraph, he says that we treated space, time, and causality as unconditional laws of universal validity, and Kant showed that these really served only to elevate the mere phenomena, the work of Maya, to the position of the soul and highest reality, as if it were the innermost and true essence of things, thus making impossible any knowledge of this essence, or in Schopenhauer's words, lulling the dreamer still more soundly asleep. So what he's talking about here is, Kant's famous work is the critique of pure reason. People often talk about Kant as this philosopher who was rigidly logical, and that's certainly true. But it would be wrong to portray Kant as someone having a faith in human reason being able to do all things and be a panacea. Nietzsche actually interprets Kant as sort of, in some way, a counter, like the first sort of pushing against the grain of the Socratic optimism of the theoretical as all-conquering, because even though Kant tried to sort of claw back from the void, as he sees that knowledge based on revelation is going away, that's no longer a valid source. We now understand through our reason and our intellect, as it has been developed over the years, that just saying because Aristotle said it or the Bible, it's in the Bible, is not sufficient to believe something. Nevertheless, he tries to claw back moral and metaphysical beliefs and justify them by reason. But that doesn't mean he thinks reason can be all things. And ultimately, he tries to delimit the boundaries of reason and say this is where, this is as far as reason can go and no further. And of course, he's talking about the phenomena-noumena distinction. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about how time, space, and causality and all of these things are seen as sort of functions of the representational world in Kant. And I'm not as familiar with a lot of Kant's metaphysics as I am with Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer seems to interpret Kant that way, and it very much makes sense in the way that Nietzsche is interpreting it here, that basically we get praise for Kant and Schopenhauer in this passage. Kant, someone who you'll see often online, people are like, oh, well, Nietzsche obviously was made fun of Kant, and he did crack some jokes at Kant's expense, but he mentions Kant quite a bit throughout his work, and this is a positive portrayal of Kant, that, it's not a wholesale endorsement of everything in Kant's philosophy. It's simply Nietzsche saying, by saying that there is the noumenon, that we can't actually know by our knowledge of the phenomenal world, Kant carved off something that could not be known by human reason, and therefore showed us that reason has a limit. And Schopenhauer sort of followed suit and continued that project, and thus they challenged Socratic optimism. And so Nietzsche, at this point in his career, might be seeing himself as sort of the next in line in this project of fighting against Socratism. And so, yeah, I think that covers it for that paragraph. So the next paragraph is where he sort of contradicts himself, where he says, with this insight of, seeing the limits of Socratic knowledge, a culture is inaugurated that I venture to call a tragic culture. And so remember earlier in the section, he correlated that with this sort of overwhelmingly Dionysian and, more Buddhistic culture. But I don't think that's necessarily what he's talking about here, because I don't think Nietzsche's goal is to transform German culture into a Buddhistic culture. I think the Hellenic culture is perhaps more to... I think he wants there to be that sort of sacred unity between the contradictory art impulses of the Apollinian and the Dionysian. And I think the pessimism of weakness that he maybe didn't fully articulate here, but which he later articulated in the preface, that he sees himself in contrast to Schopenhauer, of using these illusions to continue to entice us to life and affirming that function of illusion rather than sort of lamenting it as Schopenhauer does and looking for a way out. I don't know if what Nietzsche actually wants is a Buddhistic culture, but he says that in this new culture, wisdom will be the highest sort of, it will take the place of science as the highest end. And this is, you could interpret that a lot of ways. He says it's wisdom uninfluenced by the seductive distractions of the sciences that turns with unmoved eyes to a comprehensive view of the world and seeks to grasp the eternal suffering as its own, which does sound very Dionysian, Buddhistic, or what have you. It's also interesting because he says we're trying to grasp a comprehensive view of the world, where he just said that reason cannot do so, and so presumably wisdom can. It's not a very well-developed idea, but, we might say that it's the first step to define something as the highest value that's not simply the pursuit of knowledge. And furthermore, we also might consider in the previous paragraph how he's, challenged the idea of universal validity and universal aims. And so that's another very important seed of Nietzsche's later perspectivism. Next, we have the paragraph he quoted in the preface, where he talks about the coming generation with a heroic penchant for the tremendous. Let us imagine the bold stride of these dragon slayers, in which they turn their back on all weaklings' doctrines of optimism in order to live resolutely in wholeness and fullness. Would it not be necessary for the tragic man of such a culture, in view of his self-education for seriousness and terror, to desire a new art, the art of metaphysical comfort, to desire tragedy as his own proper Helen, and to exclaim with Faust, should not my longing overleap the distance and draw the fairest form into existence? As we discussed in the preface, Nietzsche criticizes this passage because he's still talking about desiring a metaphysical comfort, because he's very obviously hoping for Wagner to be this new art. And, it's the typical sort of almost like melodramatic, ecstatic prose here, imagining a new generation of dragon slayers who are raised in seriousness and terror of a tragic culture and now desire their metaphysical comfort, this new art that will provide them that, encounter with the indestructibility of being and so on. And that would be, this new tragedy would be their Helen, that the longing for this new art of metaphysical comfort would, would be what their longing aims for, and bring that form into existence, just as Faust brings Helen, the object of his longing, into existence through magic, basically. Again, Nietzsche's criticism of this passage was sort of the idea that you might need a metaphysical comfort at all, that he was still thinking metaphysically because, he says, in the end, that is how many of you will end up, is comforted. And he was, of course, thinking of how Wagner ended up, eventually giving in to Christianity, eventually, yes, needing some sort of comfort to tell him that, everything's going to be okay. Life actually, some higher magical power sanctions everything that goes on here, and it's made right in some sense on a ultimate level that is beyond any of the, mere illusory arisings and passings away of this world. And that, of course, Nietzsche would later hope that we would find comfort, this worldly comfort, as he puts it, and not regard this world as illusory at all. Nevertheless, I do think it's interesting because I don't know if he ever really desists from his idea that we do need illusions in order to live. The enchantment of the world, which we could see as sort of those three stages of illusion, as he called them, which are like Socratic or Hellenic or Buddhistic. We could say that, Christianity was obviously one of these world illusions, and that its fall is where he sees the danger of a coming nihilism. And then there's sort of the question of, does Nietzsche think that we need something in its place in order to fulfill those functions that Christianity fulfilled for us so we don't fall into nihilism? And I think it really is that he, just in essence, that he wishes for a justification for life and the world, which is entirely bound within the actual experiential, direct reality of life in the world, within the visual reality of life in the world, and does not have to seek for something outside of that, and to therefore regard all the beings that arise and pass away, all the change and endless flux of the world in the Heraclitean sense as the most real thing. And so, we kind of already talked about this in the preface, but just thought it's worth bringing up again here. I'm going to gloss over the rest of the paragraph here, even though it's got a fun reference to the classical Walpurgis Night from Faust and all of that, because it's sort of just a reiteration of this point and more metaphors to talk about sort of how the theoretical man is, at one point he says, so thoroughly has he been pampered by his optimistic views that he no longer wants to have anything whole, with all of nature's cruelty attaching to it. So he no longer dares entrust himself to the terrible icy current of existence. He runs timidly up and down the bank. Much of this paragraph at the end is sort of it's worth reading, but it's not very hard to understand. There's really no other ideas to tease out of it. It's just sort of Nietzsche's, it's worth reading for the prose, right? But it's Nietzsche's, again, very familiar indictments of scholars and this sort of disconnected knowledge which is not integrated into our lives and which sort of becomes encyclopedic in form. And again, this dovetails into his criticisms of German culture and use and abuse of history for life. I'll just sort of read the conclusion of section 18. That one still remains eternally hungry, the critic without joy and energy, the Alexandrian man who is at bottom a librarian and corrector of proofs. So there you have it. So now we'll move on to 19. Now here Nietzsche makes a criticism that I think is a bit long-winded, and it's one of the weaker points he makes. So we'll gloss a fair amount of section 19, but to state it directly, he says that the innermost content of the Socratic culture we live in, the Alexandrian culture, he calls it the culture of the opera. And he says, for it is in this department that this culture has expressed its aims and perceptions with special naivete, which is surprising when we compare the genesis of the opera and the facts of operatic development with the eternal truths of the Apollinian and the Dionysian. So he talks about the origin of the stilo rappresentativo, which is the representational style, and the recitative, and basically describes these as forms of music which are inherently unmusical in their origin, or they're forms of artistic performance which obviously employ music. But in the recitative, or the representational style, the emphasis is on the conveying the meaning of the words and not letting the music obscure the meaning of the words. He says that basically, quote, the listener who insists on distinctly hearing the words under the music, has his desire fulfilled by the singer, and that the latter speaks rather than sings, intensifying the pathetic expression of the words by means of this half-song. By this intensification of the pathos, he facilitates the understanding of the words and overcomes the remaining half of the music. The specific danger now threatening him is that in some unguarded moment he may stress the music unduly, which would immediately entail the destruction of the pathos of speech and the distinctness of the words, while on the other hand he feels himself continually impelled to musical discharge and a virtuoso exhibition of his vocal talent. And so here the poet comes to his aid, who knows how to provide him with abundant opportunities for lyrical interjections, repetitions of words and sentences. This alternation of emotionally impressive speech, which, however, is only half-sung, with interjections which are wholly sung, an alternation characteristic of the stilo rappresentativo, this rapidly changing endeavor to affect now the concepts and the imagination of the hearer, now his musical sense, is something so utterly unnatural and likewise so intrinsically contradictory, both to the Apollinian and Dionysian artistic impulses, that one has to infer an origin of the recitative lying outside all artistic instincts. End quote. So, the Apollinian and the Dionysian Nietzsche sees as sort of the basis of all genuine art, or all true art, basically come out of these two impulses, which are, in some sense, I mean, again, we might refer to what Nietzsche spoke of earlier, where he talked about the subjective artist as the poor artist. And what he meant there was that the artist is not fulfilling the individual subjective desires of his will in his artwork, that he's rather channeling genius or channeling the Apollinian or the Dionysian. He's sort of a mere conduit and is objectively representing, either in, dance or in his sculpture or whatever form of art it might take, or in, music in the dithyramb, sort of faithfully representing the content given to him by his god or muse, right? And so the sort of the contrived nature and the consciously thought out nature of the modern opera, the contemporary opera, in Nietzsche's view, is thoroughly unmusical, and his reason for saying this is that the representative style puts a premium on the listener understanding the words, and that basically this is it's an intellectualizing of the artistic, and taking the techniques of art which have been developed and utilizing the technique for ends which are consciously directed and which are consciously sculpted and which follow a theoretical and consciously contrived aim. And we might remember how he said earlier that in the development of Greek tragedy, the words were made to they were set to the music. They were secondary. The word concept, the image concept, were not the origin of the drama or of the music itself, but the music was the origin, that it was the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, and that the image and the word later accompanied what was first simply sort of raw musical power, right? Which Nietzsche considers to be sort of the most direct representation of the actual character of the will is music. And again, he doesn't seem to have really a rigorous argument for this, other than the fact that Schopenhauer has said it. And I think it's part of that artist's metaphysics that he's working with, that he's told us about before, that it's his prejudice here. But in any case, that this representational style of that Nietzsche sees as the origin of the contemporary opera, he believes is a reverse of what the natural creative process of music ought to be. That music is just sort of being used as a sort of musical composition has become a set of techniques that is meant to serve an intellectualized process, which means to represent things with the intellect and is thoroughly theoretical, right? And so this is his great criticism of a lot of modern culture as well, is because he sees, the opera as the high culture of Europe during his time. Furthermore, what he sees in opera is just the very thing that he has criticized throughout, which is basically romanticism. And in some sense, this is sort of a subtext, but it's one I've picked up on the more that I've gone back to this work, and the more I've learned about sort of the people like Goethe, right, who was like sort of had one foot in the classical style and one foot in the romantic. And that, because Nietzsche's charge against opera, he says, quote, "We see into the innermost development of this thoroughly modern variety of art, the opera. Art here responds to a powerful need, but it is a non-aesthetic need. The yearning for the idyllic, the faith in the primordial existence of the artistic and good man. The recitative was regarded as the rediscovered language of this primitive man, opera as the rediscovered country of this idyllically or heroically good creature, who simultaneously with every action follows a natural artistic impulse, who accomplishes his speech with a little singing in order that he may immediately break forth into full song at the slightest emotional excitement." End quote. So we might remember the cool paradoxical thoughts as a substitute for the Apollinian in Euripides and fiery Dionysian affects. Or I think he was more speaking of the new Attic comedy at that point. So we see sort of that here, and I think big picture, Nietzsche sees, and again, this is the subtext I was alluding to earlier, that the romantic and the classical views are, in some sense, two sides of the same coin. And that I'm sort of associating the classical with the theoretic here, because I think what was called the classical style of art, and, the romantic reaction to it, right? We can see how the classical has a very, in that it's sort of rooted in Aristotle and rooted in the Alexandrian in many respects. And the romantic is seen as sort of this like emotional reaction to this overly logicized, theoretic approach to culture and to life. And yet Nietzsche is sort of indicting them both here and sees opera as sort of the soul of both. And I think you can make sense of this by seeing both the classical and the romantic view of life, or however you want to call them, both those movements, as being, in Nietzsche's view, both essentially optimistic and both believing in that. With the sort of Rousseauian romantic, it's the return to the garden, return to the idyllic state of the noble savage, right? Or the Socratic Alexandrian view of we are going to use our faculty of reason, our limitless powers of knowledge to solve every problem and continually progress to some utopian future. But they're both based on optimism. And that's the thing Nietzsche basically hoped a new generation would arise to declare war on in the last section. So, and he sees opera as the sort of the soul of the artistic soul of this modern optimistic culture. And it's important that he designates it as non-aesthetic, right? Because remember, Socrates is an anti-artistic soul, and the Socratic Alexandrian culture that we inherit in this whole view, this narrative that Nietzsche has been putting forward, is accordingly non-aesthetic. He sees the yearning for the idyllic simplicity, the Rousseauian romantic return to a primitive state of, peace and happiness, the man as naturally good and naturally an artist. This whole idea is fundamentally optimistic, and Nietzsche doesn't believe, because it doesn't come from either one of the Apollinian, the dissolution or the individuation principles. It's not actually an artistic impulse. Take that for what you will. I think a lot of people might take issue with that and say, well, like, the point of a lot of art is actually to make like societal critique, or to portray an ideal society, or to portray a dystopian society so that by contrast we could gain some ideal, or to promote a certain message or a moral message. And Nietzsche would say, yeah, that's why I criticized the Aesopian fable and said that basically what drama turned into in ancient Greece was a more extended Aesopian fable, is that the point of a story is to give you a moral, and that this isn't actually true aesthetic justification for life. It's not actually providing, that's not where the art is. That's something incidental and secondary and added on to art. And so that would still be his criticism here. And that the idyllic romanticism is non-aesthetic. And he says, again, he brings up sort of the danger that he sees, this, again, Nietzschean elitism, where he says, okay, so for us, it's enough to have perceived that the essential charm and therefore the genesis of this new art form lies in the gratification of an altogether non-aesthetic need, and the optimistic glorification of man as such, and the conception of the primitive man as the man naturally good and artistic, a principle of the opera that has gradually changed into a threatening and terrible demand, which in the face of contemporary socialistic movements we can no longer ignore. The good primitive man wants his rights. What a paradisiacal prospect. And so, again, it's when the limits of that optimism, the theoretical optimism, are reached, and those promises are not delivered upon, you will have revolutions, and your society will crumble from the social unrest caused by that illusion collapsing. And so, again, this ties in with much of what Nietzsche thought throughout his work. Again, though, notice the optimistic glorification of man as such. So we might think of thus spoke Zarathustra, I love man because he's a bridge and not a goal, right? That Nietzsche doesn't articulate it really anywhere else in the text as much. He would even go on as much as, or like immediately after this in the Untimely Meditations, to begin conjuring up sort of ideas like this, of having some sort of higher ideal of what mankind could be, of our potential to stand above us that we could look to. And I guess you could say that he somewhat alludes to this with the figures of the Olympian gods that he talks about at the beginning of the book. But I think this is really the first inkling of Nietzsche's dismissal of the idea that man as he is now, mankind as it is now, that you in your current state are worth preserving. He rejects that here. He rejects the value of man in and of itself, as not as the species just in its current state as an end, self-preservation as the highest value, human life, human value as the highest value, but rather implies there's the implication, again, not the optimistic glorification of man as such. Because, here he's simply saying the optimistic glorification of man as he is now, this sort of humanism, right? And he mentions the humanists at the beginning of the passage, so it's clear that's who he's talking about, that this is like an anti-humanist passage. Not anti-human, it's very pro-human in my view, but it's anti-humanist because, the humanists are the people who say, well, this is our current state we're in now that we've, in this ever-dynamic process of evolution have made our way into, and obviously that's, the highest goal and highest achievement of nature, and the ultimate value is human life. And Nietzsche would sort of say, well, no, if we really truly believe that we are this ever-changing, ever-dynamic, pattern of life, then we should, our goal, our value, this is what his later ideas would be, should be in our potential and what we can become, right? These are all very famous ideas of Nietzsche's, but you just see that very subtlest implication or subtext here in this passage of the criticism of the humanist who places the ultimate value on man as he is now, and the optimistic view that man in his natural state, if not for the limitations of society, would naturally be good and creative and artistic and so on. And he sort of blames this again for the revolutions. And so, once again, we have, if opera is the soul, if the theoretical and the limits of the theoretical project are leading to the end of the illusion, and then that provides the danger of these uprisings and the shattering of the old social order within opera itself, the soul of this Socratic Alexandrian culture we see how all of those the same elements are there, right, on that level. And he says in the next paragraph that there's another equally obvious confirmation that opera is based on the same principles as our Alexandrian culture. And he alleges that the critic basically becomes, it's the opera is the birth of the theoretical man, the critical layman, not of the artist. His evidence for this is, again, the representational style, which he says, quote, in which text word lords it over counterpoint like master over servant. For the words, it is argued, are as much nobler than the accompanying harmonic system as the soul is nobler than the body. End quote. Again, very significant in light of Nietzsche's later philosophy, and that we see maybe the first inkling of it here in his understanding of the problem of science and the problem of theoretical culture more generally. The idea that the words conveying their, rational, discursive, conscious meaning, the lyricism, right, and the meaning conveyed in the lyricism, that is as much nobler as the soul over the body, and the body, associating music with the body is sort of, in a way it makes sense, even though the music is formless and, the body is anything but formless, but the music is this sort of, as Nietzsche, as I've mentioned before, the closest thing to a direct experience of the will, of the inner character of the will, in our fields of representation, as Nietzsche argues. And so, and music doesn't have an intelligible content in terms of, he believes that all of our sort of interpretations of what a musical passage might, quote unquote, sound like in terms of what images you might associate with it are ersatz, right? That they're not actually the music doesn't actually have the character of portraying like an idyllic scene down by a brook or, of a military battle or what have you. Now, it's not that the music is entirely, quote unquote, meaningless, but its meaning might be more a meaning of the passions, a meaning which cannot be consciously or linguistically articulated in and of itself, and that these sort of representational fixtures, they're ersatz, they're added on, they're contrived, basically with the word versus the whole harmonic system, as he calls it. You have the blind, unconscious will, and you have the Socratic articulated logos, right? The articulated conscious meaning that we represent through word concepts. And so the logos associated with the soul, it actually makes a great deal of sense here. I think this is another passage where it's that, maybe if not an example of his silent hostility towards Christianity, nevertheless prefigures the Nietzschean critique of the spirit or the soul as more real than the body. Because throughout this entire work, he thinks the music is the foundation, it's the fundamental sort of artistic reality that gives birth to tragedy, and that, in some sense, it's the separation from the primacy of music in favor of contrivances of the conscious mind in the form of words and linguistic meaning, instead taking over and parasitizing the musical process in order to make it fit with its, conscious, optimistic, theoretic goals. To get back to the beginning of the paragraph, right, he sort of says that these trends in opera are what allowed the lay critic, the person who's not himself a musician or an artist, to sort of attain prominence in society. And I mean, that is true. Like it's like in this period, of European society, where we first see like the social institution, and you might like attribute this to other things going on in society that Nietzsche didn't like now there's things like newspapers, and there's mass culture emerging, and these artistic performances aren't just religious ceremonies that you would never think to critique, right? And they're not just performed for the richest nobility or whatever. You actually have like a need or a social function that can be fulfilled by this institution of being a critic, and as part of a tastemaker in mass culture, and even if you're not an artist yourself. And so, what does he say? It was in accordance with the laically unmusical crudeness of these views that the combination of music, image, and words was effected in the beginnings of the opera. In the spirit of this aesthetic, the first experiments were made in the leading amateur circles of Florence by the poets and singers patronized there. The man incapable of art creates for himself a kind of art precisely because he is the inartistic man as such. Because he does not sense the Dionysian depth of music, he changes his musical taste into an appreciation of the understandable word and tone rhetoric of the passions in the stilo rappresentativo, and into the voluptuousness of the arts of song. Because he is unable to behold a vision, he forces the machinist and the decorative artist into his service. Because he cannot comprehend the true nature of the artist, he conjures up the artistic primitive man, and so on and so forth. So I think that's all very clear given what we've been talking about. He uses all these techniques of that have been developed, the machinist and the decorative artist, right? Opera is a form of art you can really put on a show and have costumes and all these different sort of elements, but ultimately it is a combination of music, image, and words. It is a word and tone rhetoric of the passions, right? And he charges that these are basically inartistic men who do not sense the Dionysian depth of music and cannot behold the Apollinian visions. There's then a section we'll kind of gloss over where Nietzsche talks about the idyllic tendency of the opera, and that again, this is a belief in a primitive age of man, when, quote, he lay close to the heart of nature, and owing to this naturalness had at once attained the ideal of mankind in paradisiacal goodness and artistry. And so, he says this belief is basically an expression of the taste of the laity in art, and we can see how this relates to what he sees as sort of like the origin of like socialist unrest and the just general inartistic basis of the opera, assuming that we grant Nietzsche that it does in fact have this idyllic tendency. And, perhaps we might say the universalism of the theoretical approach to life. And, he criticizes how the opera rarely, it doesn't have the features of, the tragic features of sort of expressing sorrow at the loss of forever of this natural state, but rather presents it as something always, near to us that, in fact, what does he say? The cheerfulness of eternal rediscovery, the comfortable delight in an idyllic reality, which one can at least imagine as real. But in this process, one may someday grasp the fact that the supposed reality is nothing but a fantastically silly dawdling. So, he's really, again, it's the idea that in this Alexandrian culture, a sort of maybe a compensatory side for it, maybe a safety valve on it, is this sort of romantic belief, and that there are two sides of the same coin, as we've talked about. You have to grant, part of why I don't like this section he's making sweeping claims about all of like opera. And I think like on some level, if you accept his understanding of what art is, and the Apollinian and the Dionysian is like the basis of all art, it makes sense. And I can see why he would have, through that set of definitions, the basis to call certain things artistic or unartistic. But you do have to grant him quite a few things in order to really glean anything out of this. And it's also not a cultural style that really holds relevance to us today. I mean, opera is like, it's practically crushed under the weight of its own pretensions today. I mean, I'm not just saying that because it's like, oh, it's not part of the mass culture. It's just, it seems very, it doesn't seem to have the vitality that it once did. It seems like a legacy art form in some sense, so that more than anything is like a social, like preening, like event for the elites, or like a certain kind of person who wants to, appear cultured. I know that that's not true everywhere. Like in Europe, a lot of people still very much enjoy the opera. But I just don't think it has the same central cultural role to understanding Western culture that maybe it did in Nietzsche's time. I think you could maybe make a decent argument, again, like maybe the point he makes about Aesopian fables and how much of our storytelling is just like a more spun out complex version of an Aesopian fable. And that's a part and parcel with Alexandrian culture. You could very fairly make that critique of our society and our artistic productions today as well. So we'll move on. Much of the rest of the passage is sort of, he compares the form of opera to the new Attic dithyramb. So again, sort of making the comparison between Alexandrian forms of art taking hold in ancient Greece and destroying the Hellenic tragedy to, today. Although later he says, Kant and Schopenhauer began to show the limits of the Socratic, and then Goethe, of course, portrays this in Faust in an artistic form, and then now here you have Nietzsche, who's calling for a return to the Hellenic. So later he actually says, well, in Germany it seems we're going backwards, like that we're moving from the Alexandrian back to the Hellenic, right? But again, he's just finding parallels between his own culture and the ancient Greeks. And he says that, what hopes must revive in us when the most certain auspices guarantee the reverse process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our modern world. And so he says that German music is something which is terribly inexplicable and seen as overwhelmingly hostile compared with the Socratic culture, because he sees in German music from Bach to Beethoven and from Beethoven to Wagner this sort of rebirth of the Dionysian, or at least the potential for something which is the reawakening of the Dionysian spirit. And so we're going to go to like the last paragraph because he recalls what he said about Kant and Schopenhauer, actually, where he says, quote, "Let us recollect further that Kant and Schopenhauer made it possible for the spirit of German philosophy, streaming from similar sources, to destroy scientific Socratism's complacent delight in existence by establishing its boundaries." So we talked about all that, and how through this delimitation was introduced an infinitely profounder and more serious view of ethical problems and of art, which we may designate as Dionysian wisdom comprised in concepts, end quote. So this is where I both agree and differ with Kaufman, and part of it's so hard to interpret Nietzsche because he does contradict himself, but where he says like, oh, well, the Dionysian came to mean a totally different thing in Nietzsche's later career. It's really like sort of concentric circles of, I think, what he was focusing on and how he interpreted the Dionysian at given times, and then also genuine inconsistencies, because he says, well, later in Nietzsche's work, he says Goethe could have been a Dionysian, and that certainly doesn't fit with the wild, ecstatic view of Dionysian ritual that he gives here. But in this work, he just said that the philosophy of Kant is Dionysian. Let that sink in, right? The philosophy of Kant is Dionysian, according to the standards laid out in Birth of Tragedy. Why? Because it delimits the boundaries of Socratism, of knowledge as being able, reason as being able to reach into the true world and gift us this true knowledge of the good, the beautiful, the true, the forms or whatever the case may be. Kant showed us that, no, you can't actually have knowledge of the true world. And so, It's why it's best to start with, as we did in the podcast, how the true world finally became a fable, because it's like, even though it's in Nietzsche's last year where he was kind of manic at times, it's like one of the most sober analyses Nietzsche puts forward for not only describing the whole history of Western philosophy, but also the development of his own thought, I think, at least to some extent. I mean, I don't think he was ever a Platonist, but you know what I mean. I mean, he begins as a sort of pre-Socratic, pre-Platonically minded philosopher, to the extent he's a philosopher at all during his period of studying the Greeks. And so if not, someone like, if not Platonic in his thought, metaphysical as he's been throughout this whole work, right? But again here he explicit praise for Kant as someone who halted the Socratic in order to open up the possibility for the Dionysian to emerge. And so he sees Kant. I mean, part of this is also just like sort of Germanism. It's very odd given all the things Nietzsche later says about the Germans, but his assessment of German culture, for whatever criticisms he may have, does seem to be at least somewhat positive insofar as the Germans are a counter to Socratism. And just as we see that in German music, he's now recalling us to German philosophy. He says, quote, "To what then does the mystery of this oneness of German music and philosophy point, if not to a new form of existence, concerning whose character we can only inform ourselves by surmise from Hellenic analogies? For to us who stand on the boundary line between two different forms of existence, the Hellenic prototype retains this immeasurable value." What does he say? "Except that we, as it were, pass through the chief epochs of the Hellenic genius analogically in reverse order, and seem now, for instance, to be passing backward from the Alexandrian age to the period of tragedy." That was the passage I referenced before we got to it. And then he says, "At the same time, we have a feeling that the birth of a tragic age simply means a return to itself of the German spirit, a blessed self-rediscovery after powerful, intrusive influences had for a long time compelled it, living as it did in a helpless and unchaste barbarism, to servitude under their form." So, the Alexandrian culture, perhaps carried on Christianity, or in whatever form they've inherited it, Nietzsche is sort of alleging it's not in the German essence or character to be Alexandrian, and that we are sort of a kind with the ancient Greeks, and we are rediscovering ourselves in, rediscovering the Dionysian, discovering the limits of Socratic knowledge, which is not really, it's actually inimical to the German character. He basically says we're being attached to the lead strings of a Romanic civilization. So we're getting it from the Romans. Perhaps the Romans are very Alexandrian people. In one sense, from one way of looking at it, I could see the argument there. And so he says we're experiencing a rebirth of tragedy and are in danger alike of not knowing whence it comes and of being unable to make clear to ourselves whither it tends. So, period of great danger and opportunity at the rebirth of tragedy. Of course, much of his claims and ideas about the German spirit, as he puts here, are not only a bit, in retrospect, it's kind of, I'm searching for the right word. It's like naive would be the best word. Naive, not in the sense Nietzsche's been using it to refer to like an idyllic primitive person, but naive in the colloquial sense. And later Nietzsche would recognize it as naive, right? So we can excuse it because he realized his mistake. When we get into section 20, unfortunately, we get kind of more rehashed ideas. I mean, he starts out saying that, unique praise must be accorded to the noblest intellectual efforts of Goethe, Schiller, and Winckelmann, but that we Germans have not yet, our endeavor to attain to the culture of the Greeks has grown feebler and feebler as the years have gone on. He says that we shouldn't, despair, for the sake of the German spirit, for these champions. They attempted to penetrate into the core of the Hellenic nature and establish an alliance between German and Greek culture. But he then sort of lapses back into his criticism that he's had throughout, which I think it's actually sort of the repetition and the just unnecessary nature of some of these passages later that bother me more than anything else in this book, where he goes back to attacking what does he say? Opinions concerning the value of the Greeks have been degenerating in the most alarming manner. What does he mean? Well, Greek beauty, Greek cheerfulness, Greek harmony. I feel like he's given us plenty of criticism of that already. But where we may see sort of a redeeming factor in this section 20 is that Nietzsche is essentially critiquing the educational institutions for not doing their job of enculturating the next generation, of not providing an education or knowledge that actually changes one's life and is like integrated into affecting their actions and character. But and he also sort of compares, he says, the journalist, the paper slave of the day, triumphs over the professor in all matters pertaining to culture, and nothing remains to the latter but the metamorphosis, often experienced by now, of fluttering also like a cheerful, cultured butterfly with the light elegance peculiar to the sphere, employing the journalist's style. And so, I think that's a critique we could apply to our own society today. And it's a problem I find with a lot of like popularized forms of learning. Adopting the journalist style. I mean, we see it all the time. I mean, what is the journalist style? It's what do they call it? It's like the inverted pyramid of like most important, most eye-catching, most clickbaity, as we would say in the 21st century, bits of information that are going to hook your reader in at the beginning of the article. And then, like the less interesting details as the article continues, and keep it short and to the point, right? Because people are busy and attention is it's the most sought after thing among the journalists, right? And so adopting the journalist style is to turn your eye away from that which is long-standing, permanent, of consequence for generations down the line, and to instead turn your attention to what is momentary, and trying to catch people's eye and hold their attention as long as possible in the now. And I think Nietzsche's probably correct that the kind of professor that he might imagine as the ideal professor, the one who really does, like a true mentor and instructor who shapes and ennobles a new generation into the proper way to live their lives, is like the farthest thing from the journalist. And the journalist is that type of communication, that is what dominates the culture. And of course it would be, because that is what is going to be the most powerful for holding people's attention and grabbing people's attention in the moment, and turning them away from anything that is of lasting value or higher value than the present moment. And so these are very familiar criticisms that we see in like Use and Abuse of History for Life, Schopenhauer as Educator, in the Untimely Meditations. And, and so we get, quote, "There has never been another period in the history of art in which so-called culture and true art have been so estranged and opposed as we may observe them to be at present. We can understand why so feeble a culture hates true art. It fears destruction from its hands. But has not an entire cultural form, namely the Socratic Alexandrian, exhausted itself after culminating in such a daintily tapering point as our present culture? If heroes like Goethe and Schiller could not succeed in breaking open the enchanted gate which leads into the Hellenic magic mountain, then what could the epigonies of such heroes hope for? What could the students, the sort of the offspring of such cultural heroes as Goethe and Schiller, hope to do if Goethe did not already do it, right? And, that was a very common opinion. It still is today about German culture post-Goethe. Remember we talked about Hollingdale basically said Goethe reaped the fruits in every category of German literature and poetry, and left everyone to sort of pick up the scraps after him. And so he's sort of this whole section is sort of laying out what Nietzsche sees the problem as, saying there have been many attempts to sort of reunite our culture with true art, because our Socratic Alexandrian culture is exhausted, and in some sense it needs art, but it fears art's ability to destroy, because really Nietzsche's saying that art comes from that power of myth, right? The living power of myth that is dangerous and can reshape culture and reshape states of mind, in his view. And so we're beginning to see, like, from the view of what art is that he's crafted, how he really does see how someone like Wagner, how you could have like a musician with a cult of personality behind him and a social movement behind him make a form of music that could like break through the current cultural assumptions and values and conventions and reshape people's hearts and minds into something new. And so, it's interesting to look at this passage from that angle as well. We also get it's actually, here's like some insight into like how I choose the still image for the various episodes of the podcast, or at least one episode, the Schopenhauer's Educator episode. I picked this image of this knight on horseback who looks kind of like tired, and looks like it's like sunset. I believe he's like visiting a grave or a shrine or something like that. But I was thinking of this passage where Nietzsche says that Schopenhauer was a knight who lacked all hope, but he desired truth. He has no peers, he says. We might remember how he portrays Schopenhauer in the Schopenhauer's Educator when he contrasts him with sort of the other cultural types that have arisen. The Rousseau man and the Goethe type of man, and then Schopenhauer is sort of like the version that he has the most admiration for, who is this essentially heroic figure. He says, one who is disconsolate and lonely could not choose a better symbol than the knight with death and devil, the armored knight with the iron, hard look, who knows how to pursue his terrible path undeterred by his gruesome companions, and yet without hope, alone with his horse and dog. So, relating to the rest of the passage, this is sort of like what he's hoping for. He says that Schopenhauer is this like spot of fertile and healthy soil in German culture, right? We only have like a few solitary examples of such people, and Schopenhauer has no peers. So that's the context in the passage. Because he's like hoping for this revitalization of the German spirit, but he sees it's worth just talking about for a moment that portrayal of Schopenhauer, because it demonstrates what he admired about Schopenhauer and what he still admires about Schopenhauer, and how he interpreted Schopenhauer's like sort of struggle with life and philosophy as essentially a heroic one, and how he took admiration or took influence from it, even if he rejected Schopenhauer on many key points. And the rest of section 20 is really just more poetry and we get another like reference to Faust here. It is almost too excessive, the poetic prose, where Kaufman's footnote says the passage reads like a parody of Wagner, but certainly was not meant to be satirical. I'll leave it to others to, but it's sort of, just as a sample, it's like I'll just read the last paragraph. If you haven't been like reading along with me and you're like counting on me to read through every section of this, just as a sample of sort of what the prose at the end of the section is like, he says, quote, "Yes, my friends, believe with me in Dionysian life and the rebirth of tragedy. The age of the Socratic man is over. Put on wreaths of ivy, put the thyrsus into your hand, and do not be surprised when tigers and panthers lie down fawning at your feet. Only dare to be tragic men, for you are to be redeemed." So, so on and so forth. It's not much content, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And it's just sort of Nietzsche expressing his hopes for a rebirth of tragedy. And then he goes in section 21, which we're now going to go to. He says, returning from these hortatory tones to the mood befitting contemplation. So he's like, "Oh, I got a little bit, ahead of myself there. Let's go back to sort of a mood of cool contemplation." And so in this section, Nietzsche tells us, he sort of reiterates or recapitulates yet again, where he says, It's the people of the tragic mysteries that fights the battles against the Persians, and the people that fought these wars in turn needs tragedy as a necessary potion to recover. Who would have supposed that precisely this people, after it had been deeply agitated through several generations by the strongest spasms of the Dionysian demon, should still have been capable of such a uniformly vigorous effusion of the simplest political feeling, the most natural patriotic instincts, and the original manly desire to fight. After all, one feels in every case in which the Dionysian excitement gains any significant extent, how the Dionysian liberation from the fetters of the individual finds expression, first of all, in a diminution of, an indifference to, indeed hostility to, the political instincts. Just as certainly Apollo, who formed states, is also the genius of the principiant individuationist, and state and patriotism cannot live without an affirmation of the individual personality. End quote. That last remark I'm not entirely sure about, but I think it really, I don't know, like in the actual anthropological history of Greece, it makes sense as the state as an aggregation of all these sort of individual associations, broader and broader associations until you have the city-state. But I don't know how the the breakdown of all boundaries and a common communal feeling would be like inimical to patriotism. I don't know. Maybe I guess you could make some argument about how you can't really be patriotic or really have a devotion to your state out of a sense of like moral duty unless you have an individual sense of duty, right? And that we're not actually, human beings aren't ants, and that we can't actually just act as a collective or like bees or like a hive, right? We need to have like an individual sense of duty in order to be motivated to serve the collective, blah, blah, blah. And that individuation, like individual and collective ends or goals or moral frameworks are sort of mutually interdependent rather than, against one another, and or rather than mutually exclusive. That's what I was looking for, the term I was looking for. And so the Dionysian destroys the individual and thereby destroys any sort of possibility of collective feeling. And then that's maybe what Nietzsche is sort of referencing with the festivals of Sacaea in the East that overwhelmed these ancient Eastern societies and destroyed their traditional mores and morals and laws, and that the Greeks, he's basically saying, how they seem to be enlivened by tragedy of all things and still had the strength. I guess it's just sort of a proof of the case. They had the strength to fight the Persians, who were like one of the greatest empires of all time, and the Greeks, who were like this scattered collection of individual city-states, right, still had a sense of a national feeling of all being Greek, and they seem to draw strength from tragedy. They use the Dionysian in order to enliven and give them strength rather than overwhelming and destroying them. And, again, I guess he brings it up here. From orgies, a people can take one path only, the path to Indian Buddhism. And in order that this may be endurable at all with its yearning for the nothing, it requires these rare ecstatic states with their elevation above space, time, and the individual. This is why I said earlier I don't think Nietzsche's goal, why he mixes up the term tragic culture, referring to both Hellenic and Buddhistic culture, and that he does not want to turn, when he says he wishes for a new tragic culture to emerge in Germany, I don't think he was wanting to turn it into a Buddhistic culture, because here, even though we might see how he might have some sort of admiration for the Buddhistic East based on Schopenhauer, he has already rejected the Schopenhauerian goal of the negation of the will, which has been, I think, even though he wavers in his devotion to Schopenhauer's ideas throughout, that is the common thread, that he actually wants to affirm life and the illusions that make life possible, not dispel those illusions or, negate those illusions on the basis that, life is not worth living, and that was the suffering of the world makes life worth, negating or something like that. Nietzsche doesn't believe that. Even in this book, when he is under the heaviest influence of Schopenhauer of any of his books, and we see here, he doesn't think the Dionysian, the raw, unadulterated Dionysian urge overwhelming a society is a good thing. It's very, again, you have to grant Nietzsche a lot of things like from orgies that people can take one path only to Buddhism. It's like outside of this text, if you heard that sentence, you would say, what? That doesn't make any sense. But again, sort of what he's saying is, if you break down all of the, what would you say, all of the moral basis for people to know thyself or to practice all things in moderation, all sort of the individuating boundaries and hierarchies and sort of the order of society in which people can then enact ambition and activity and strive. Without those things, if you just sort of like level everything and get rid of all that, what do you have, right? You have a monastery. You have a bunch of people who are going to have no drive or desire to advance in life or, engage in activity or ambition in life. And so what is there to do other than to just sort of, live an austere life and practice Zen meditation, I guess. So again, I find a lot of this very questionable, like historically and anthropologically, but I'm just trying to put together the philosophical ideas for you that we've seen why he would refer to a society that's unrestrained Dionysian impulses as like a Buddhistic one, and that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about the breakdown of all like moral and social and legal boundaries. So what does he say? Where political drives are to be taken to be absolutely valid. So remember, he's sort of saying the Apollinian is the basis of all political drives. And maybe that I didn't emphasize that sufficiently, talking about, from orgies that people can take one path only to Indian Buddhism. That allowing the Dionysian to completely level the political distinctions between peoples is really the issue, and that there's no possibility for then political striving, right? Or for a political hierarchy. That's where you get the path to Indian Buddhism. Again, still questionable historically, but so he says, where the political drives are taken to be absolutely valid, it is just as necessary that a people should go the path toward the most extreme secularization, whose most magnificent but also terrifying expression may be found in the Roman Imperium. Placed between India and Rome and pushed toward a seductive choice, the Greeks succeeded in inventing a third form in classical purity. To be sure, one they did not long use themselves, but one that precisely for that reason gained immortality. And so skipping down the passage, he says, that staunch perseverance which characterized, for example, the national instincts of the Romans probably does not belong among the necessary predicates of perfection. But let us ask by means of what remedy it was possible for the Greeks during their great period, in spite of the extraordinary strength of their Dionysian and political instincts, not to exhaust themselves either in ecstatic brooding or in a consuming chase after worldly power and worldly honor, but rather to attain that splendid mixture which resembles a noble wine, in making one feel fiery and contemplative at the same time. Here we must think clearly of the tremendous power that stimulated, purified, and discharged the whole life of the people, tragedy. Okay, so the Romans, I guess, I talked about his reference to the Romanic as associated with the Alexandrian, right? And we see here Rome associated with political striving, and says the Greeks were placed between India and Rome, and he associated political striving with the Apollinian, with the individuating impulse as well, striving after worldly power and worldly wealth and success and worldly domains, right? And so, again, we can see how Rome fits into that, given the intensely pragmatic and the pragmatic nature of the Roman people and their expansionist political, empire. And we could also say that there was a Apollinian or even an Alexandrian streak that perhaps the Romans inherit from the later Greeks, insofar as there is sort of a Alexandrian theoretical Socratic element, right, to the Roman, especially like the Roman patricians of the late Republic, who seem to believe that they've created this, that they have the best form of government that's been created, And you had a struggle between the optimists who believed that it was like the modern degeneration that was destroying this perfect form of government, or the populares who believed they needed to reform in order to improve the Roman, polity and make it better. You had this idea of Rome's like special, imperial destiny and this endless desire to expand and achieve greater and greater things. There is something theoretical and optimistic about the pursuit of worldly political power, I suppose you could say. And Rome expanded in a way that the Greek city-states never really did, at least not until, the time of Alexander. And so in any case, you have Rome as the, individuating Apollinian example. India, again, used for the Buddhistic culture. And then you have the Hellenic culture, which, again, clearly should be correlated with the tragic here. And the next paragraph is kind of just another, summarizing, but it's a good one, so I'll read it because it'll help us along. He says, quote, "The myth protects us against the music." He's speaking of sort of what goes on in this interplay of the Apollinian and Dionysian in tragedy. He says, quote, "The myth protects us against the music, while on the other hand, it alone gives music the highest freedom. In return, music imparts to the tragic myth an intense and convincing metaphysical significance that word and image without this singular help could never have attained. And above all, it is through music that the tragic spectator is overcome by an assured premonition of a highest pleasure, attained through destruction and negation, so he feels as if the innermost abyss of things spoke to him perceptively." End quote. As Kaufman points out, highest pleasure is an allusion to Faust's last words in Goethe's play, where he says, I've now attained the highest moment of the highest pleasure. And so Nietzsche proposing tragedy as the solution to Faust, right? Again, because of the power of myth as embodied in tragedy and kept and allowed to still live within tragedy. And again, it's a useful recapitulation because he also talks again how music, that relationship between music and the word and image, right? And why the relationship that opera has between music and word and image is sort of backwards from Nietzsche's point of view, and why tragedy gets it right. We're going to skip over quite a bit in this section as well, because in a sense, the next several paragraphs are Nietzsche's review of Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. And, just as a sample, he said, "Suppose a human being has thus put his ear, as it were, to the heart chamber of the world will, and felt the roaring desire for existence pouring from there into all the veins of the world. How could he endure to perceive the echo of innumerable shouts of pleasure and woe in the wide space of the world night? Here the tragic myth and the tragic hero intervene between our highest musical emotion and the music, at bottom only as symbols of the most universal facts of which only music can speak so directly." And so he in a way, he's writing with very effusive prose, praising Wagner's music's ability to sort of recapitulate to these Apollinian and Dionysian art forces and their interplay within his opera. That is the summary of what he's saying here. That he basically says in a sort of preliminary paragraph to this discussion of Tristan and Isolde that he's going to appeal to those who have a musical feeling, to the genuine musicians, and tell them to just listen by way of example to Tristan and Isolde. And, could you, without the aid of any word or image, purely as a tremendous symphonic movement, if you were to experience Tristan and Isolde, could you do it without expiring in a spasmodic unharnessing of all the wings of the soul, right? So this is the part of the book that I'm sure Wagner loved. But it is interesting because he's, again, sort of laying out how that interplay between the Apollinian and the Dionysian works. Again, to repeat what I said, it's like, or the part I read before, the tragic myth and the tragic hero emerge as symbols of the most universal facts, of which only music can speak so directly. But if our feelings were those of entirely Dionysian beings, myth as a symbol would remain totally ineffective and unnoticed. Yet here the Apollinian power erupts to restore the almost shattered individual with the healing balm of blissful illusion, right? So I think if you've been following along with this analysis so far, and if you've read the book up to this point, what Nietzsche's saying about the Apollinian and the Dionysian interplaying in Tristan and Isolde are just sort of a repetition of how he talked about it in tragedy. You should be able to glean all this pretty easily. But there's an interesting part a bit towards the end of section 21, a couple paragraphs from the end, where he says, quote, "Concerning the process just described, we may still say with equal assurance that it is merely a glorious appearance, namely the aforementioned Apollinian illusion, whose influence aims to deliver us from the Dionysian flood and excess. For at bottom, the relation of music to drama is precisely the reverse. Music is the real idea of the world. Drama is but the reflection of this idea, a single silhouette of it. The identity between the melody and the living figure, between the harmony and the character relations of that figure, is true in a sense opposite to what one would suppose in the contemplation of musical tragedy. It remains merely a phenomenon from which no bridge leads us to a true reality, into the heart of the world. But music speaks out of this heart. And though countless phenomena of the kind were to accompany this music, they could never exhaust its essence, but would always be nothing more than its externalized copies." And so this is what I mean, where I've stressed throughout that I think Nietzsche really means this when he's saying these things about music as speaking directly out of the heart of the world. And he does, attempt to draw on Schopenhauer in the passage I mostly glossed over, but, again, you can read it if you want. From World and Will as Will and Representation, where Schopenhauer talks about how music is the most direct experience with the intelligible content of the will. But ultimately, that argument doesn't hold up, and how could it? I mean, I don't even think it necessarily holds up that Schopenhauer taps into an ontological reality by looking deep within himself and determining that the intelligible content of his own subjective experiences will, and that therefore the intelligible content of every other phenomena he sees as will. That doesn't logically follow, right? So this isn't a argument we're proceeding on by strict logical inference. This is something Nietzsche feels, that the music is the most real thing, and he goes so far as, in the paragraph I just read, to basically make music the true world, and the dramatization of it, and the images and concepts that are carried on music, to be mere representations of the ontological reality of music. And that as much as Schopenhauer stresses will as the most basic rendering of what the intelligible content of the noumenon is, for Nietzsche, even though he brings up the will throughout this passage and talks about, the primordial suffering and contradiction and pain, the eternal, indestructible living being behind all reality, really it's music in this work. If we had to give it one word, it's before Nietzsche comes to the will to power, he seems to think that it's music. And I don't think that's based on anything more than his love of music. I really don't. And, music is such a powerful thing, as he attests to throughout this work, that it can make you think at times, like, when you're listening to a really rapturous song, you're like, this is like, what is it Rust Cole says in True Detective? I'm mainlining the secret truth of the universe, right? And I say that as just such a musician myself who's had those thoughts. But none of this is philosophical ideas. I mean, it's basically mysticism. And so this is it's a mystical text in some sense. And so he says, as for the intricate relationship of music and drama, nothing can be explained, while everything may be confused by the popular and thoroughly false contrast of soul and body. But the unphilosophical crudeness of this contrast seems to have become, who knows for what reasons, a readily accepted article of faith among our aestheticians, while they have learned nothing of the contrast of the phenomenon and the thing in itself, or for equally unknown reasons have not cared to learn anything about it. It's really funny because, I mean, really, they're just getting the noumenon and the phenomenon backwards, right? The thing in itself is the drama, and the phenomenon is the music, and the operatic, theoretic, Socratic, Alexandrian mindset that Nietzsche has criticized throughout. Nietzsche's saying they have it wrong. The origin is music. Music is the primal reality. That is the intelligible content. And the drama is the phenomenon. It's a phantasm. And these representations can never exhaust the essence of the real content of the music, right? So, Nietzsche's critique there is really just him saying they have it backwards. But he says they have learned nothing of the contrast of the phenomenon and the thing in itself. Probably just because he's associating Kant and Schopenhauer with himself and the Dionysian rejection of Socratism. Should our analysis have established that the Apollinian element in tragedy has, by means of its illusion, gained a complete victory over the primordial Dionysian element of music, making music subservient to its aims, namely to make the drama as vivid as possible, it would certainly be necessary to add a very important qualification. At the most essential point, this Apollinian illusion is broken and annihilated. Skipping a little further down, he says, the Apollinian illusion reveals itself as what it really is, the veiling during the performance of the tragedy of the real Dionysian effect. But the latter is so powerful that it ends by forcing the Apollinian drama itself into a sphere where it begins to speak with Dionysian wisdom and even denies itself and its Apollinian visibility. Thus, the intricate relation of the Apollinian and the Dionysian in tragedy may really be symbolized by a fraternal union of the two deities. Dionysus speaks the language of Apollo, and Apollo finally the language of Dionysus, and so the highest goal of tragedy and of all art is attained. End quote. So suppose the final paragraph there is just to say that, because he said that it's the Apollinian illusion that delivers us from the Dionysian flood and excess, that primordial power of the music that can overwhelm and destroy whole societies. But lest we think that all tragedy is simply the Apollinian enclosing the Dionysian and using it for its own power, Nietzsche rejects this and says that the breaking of the Apollinian illusion is part of the drama, and that ultimately this meta element of tragedy, this meta element that we've discussed earlier, actually, in earlier segments of this analysis, it provides an awareness of the fact that it is simply an Apollinian illusion, and the ultimate triumph of the Dionysian in the field of Apollinian representation ultimately transcends the Apollinian totally. And so that Nietzsche really the point in this, I wouldn't get bogged down because he gets very Byzantine again in this section, because I think he's really sort of spinning a yarn at this point at some points. But that he does make the important point at the end here that it has to be understood as a complete union between these two deities, and that neither can be understood as taking precedence over the other. That tragedy really is an intricate interplay that requires both. And I think with that, we will end, and the next 4 sections will be the last. And I think that actually will be an even shorter episode than this, because we're coming to the very, very end. So thank you, everyone, for coming along with me. This is taking a lot longer than I thought it would, but I don't know. I'm actually enjoying it. It's like, as I've said before, one of my favorite works by Nietzsche, and it's good to get very in-depth with it. So I think compared to how difficult some of the sections have been that we've talked about so far, I think the last 4 are going to be a breeze. All right. Bye, everybody. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.